Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be reading you 4 true ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce any names wrong, I do apologize. Home invasion, Baldoon, Ontario. When John T. MacDonald moved his bride into the house he'd built near his father's, he was looking forward to a happy, peaceful life raising a family there. He planned to keep farming the land he shared with his dad in the little village of Baldoon, not far from what's now Chatham, Ontario. And things went pretty much as planned, until 1829. By then the MacDonalds had 3 children, one still an infant. Jane, a teenage cousin of John's, was also living with them, helping Miss MacDonald with the children and the housework. But early in the summer of 1829, the MacDonald home began playing host to some very unwelcome guests. Late one night, Miss MacDonald awoke to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. Frightened, she nudged her husband awake, and they both lay still in their bed, trying to figure out what was happening. The noise grew louder, as if several people were now trudging around outside their door. Then they heard their baby cry. It slept in a tiny room off the kitchen, and its cry was a call to action. MacDonald leaped out of bed and yanked open the door to the kitchen. What he found left him stunned and confused. The room was empty and eerily still. After comforting the baby, the MacDonalds decided to keep quiet about what had happened, and they didn't tell their neighbors about the footsteps they heard marching loudly up to their front door on other nights that summer, or about how every now and then some family members sensed an unseen presence following them around in the house. The last thing they wanted was to have everyone in Baldoon whispering about their house being haunted, but people started talking openly, not just whispering. When word got out about what happened in the MacDonald's barn later in the fall, many of Baldoon's farmers were working together, bringing in the last of the harvest, and several young women, including Jane, had gathered in the MacDonald's barn to make straw hats. Suddenly, without warning, a heavy log beam came crashing down on the barn door, not far from the girls. Startled, they regrouped in another part of the barn and went back to their hat making. Not long after, though, another beam broke loose, and then another. Unharmed but frightened, the girls scurried out of the barn and took shelter in the house. Feeling safe in the kitchen, they began to calm down. But not for long. Even though no gunshots rang out, bullets started piercing the windows, leaving small, round holes in the glass. The bullets didn't whiz through the room, they simply fell to the floor after coming through the panes. But the young women feared for their lives. They fled from the house and headed across the fields to another barn. At first, the neighbors didn't believe the girls when they blurted out what had happened. Then a young man who had stopped by the MacDonald house looking for Jane showed up. He had noticed the holes in the windows and had gone inside to see what was wrong. He'd seen the bullets on the floor and had slipped one into his pocket. When he pulled it out, the girl's story started to ring true. It also started to spread, and before long, the community of Baldoon was abuzz with reports of the unnatural events taking place at the MacDonald house. Over the next several months, more bullets flew through the windows, then stones and lead sinkers used to hold down fishing nets. The scary incidents usually took place in the afternoon and early evening, so groups of curious neighbors were often on hand to witness them. They saw not just projectiles flying into the house, but also kettles full of boiling water lifted off the hearth chairs and beds moving as if being pushed around in invisible hands, and knives whipping across the kitchen amazingly, though no one was hurt by any of this, at least not physically. But the MacDonalds were suffering. They could find no sane explanation for what was happening to them, and they no longer felt safe in their home. Desperate, they turned to prayerful priests and ministers, psychic researchers, and spell-casting witch hunters to end their torment, but without success. If anything, small fires started breaking out all over, in closets, cupboards, and corners of every room in the house, and outside of the barn. Family and friends spent long hours on fire watch duty, rushing to douse the nasty balls of flames whenever they mysteriously flared up. But one morning in the fall of 1830, the fires got the better of them. As the MacDonalds sat in the kitchen eating breakfast, The house began to fill with smoke. Escaping with just the clothes on their backs, they joined the volunteers who raced over to fight the blaze as soon as they spotted the smoke. But their efforts were in vain. The house was left a blackened, burned-out shell, and not long after that, so was the barn. The people of Baldoon were quick to help MacDonald rebuild and to let the family stay with them in the meantime, but it seemed as if the unnatural force that had plagued the MacDonalds for so long was following them. The neighbors, fearful of the flash fires and the moving furniture that invaded their homes too, eventually gave up trying to house the unfortunate family. John and his wife moved into a tent, and Jane and the children moved in with John's father, Daniel. But fires broke out in Daniel's house too, and it was only with the help of shifts of watchful neighbors that he prevented his home from being reduced to ashes. Then in the spring of 1831, as mysteriously as it had begun, the horror ended. Years later, neighbors would give statements detailing all they had witnessed in the MacDonald's house and in their own homes. Many of them would also note how calm and happy Jane had been throughout the horrible ordeal. Some students of the paranormal see her behavior as evidence that a poltergeist, a nasty, disruptive ghost, had been at work in Baldoon. Apparently, poltergeists usually pester people if a young person is around. But what the MacDonalds suffered was much more than pestering. It was torture of the worst kind, frightening torment by the unknown force for no reason at all. Alarming fires, Caledonia Mills, Nova Scotia. Nearly a century after the MacDonalds were tormented in Ontario, and more than 1,500 kilometers east of Nova Scotia, another family named MacDonald suffered through a similar nightmarish experience. In the early 1900s, Alexander MacDonald, his wife Janet, and their adopted daughter Mary Ellen lived on a farm near Caledonia Mills, about 40 kilometers southeast of Antigonish. Like John MacDonald in Baldoon, Alexander MacDonald tried not to let the warning signs that something strange might be happening on the farm worry him. He was already in his 70s the first time the cows got out of the barn in 1921, so he just figured his gnarled hands weren't tying knots as well as they used to. He simply made sure to tie better knots the next time. But the cows got loose again and again. Even when he wrapped the ropes tethering the cows around big nails, they still managed to get out of their stalls and wander off. His horse was acting up too. Each morning he'd find it in a stall different from the one he'd locked it in the night before. For 2 weeks the cows kept escaping and the horse kept switching places. Then, to MacDonald's great relief, these strange goings-on stopped. Later he would look back on them as minor annoyances compared to what he had coped with in January 1922. MacDonald could explain away the first fire that started in the early hours of January 6th. He didn't discover it until he came downstairs in the morning and found a burnt-out hole in the kitchen ceiling above the wood stove. He couldn't understand how, but he decided that glowing cinders from the stove were to blame. Then he smelled the smoke. Following his nose, he rushed to the living room and found a couch and chair on fire. He beat out the small blazes and left the room afraid and confused. When the fires flared up again 3 days later, a frantic MacDonald turned to his neighbors for help. 3 of them agreed to come over and keep watch with him. That night they beat out or poured water on nearly 40 fires in different rooms of the house. Fortunately, none of them was hurt because for no reason they could come up with, the flames were cold. The fiery flare-ups continued the next day and the day after that. Finally, Alexander, Janet, and Mary Ellen couldn't take any more. Exhausted, confused, and absolutely terrified, they decided to go and stay with neighbors for a while. By then, word of their torment had reached Halifax. Never one to pass up a good story, W.H. Dennis, the editor of the Halifax Herald, ran an article about it. Several weeks later, he sent a reporter named Harold Wyden and a detective named B.O. Carroll to follow up on what had been going on at the MacDonald's farm. When they arrived in Caledonia Mills, Alexander agreed to take them to his house and spend the night there with them. Most of the furniture had been moved outside when it caught fire. So when it was time for bed, the 3 men settled down on a pile of rugs in the dining room, huddled under blankets to keep out the winter chill. No fire started that night, but what did happen was newsworthy. Carol heard the thumping sounds and footsteps upstairs first, and when the other 2 woke up, they heard them too. After a few minutes, the noises moved to the living room. Then an invisible hand smacked Wyden's upper arm and brushed against Carol's wrist. Even though the noises died down and no one felt any more ghostly contact, it was all the three men could do to spend the rest of the night in the house. When Carol and Wyden reported back to the Herald's editor, Dennis decided to invite an American psychic researcher by the name of Walter F. Prince to investigate the fires further. Prince agreed to come to Nova Scotia in March 1922. He spent a week interviewing the MacDonalds and their neighbors and carefully examining the fire-plagued house. Then he gave Dennis a report of his findings, and the Herald ran an article based on it. The MacDonalds were very upset when they read it, ignoring testimony from several witnesses that their daughter hadn't been anywhere near many of the fires when they broke out. Prince had concluded that Mary Ellen had started the fires probably unintentionally while suffering from some sort of mental problem. The elderly couple dismissed the report of sensational speculation, and why not? By then, they were living back in their home with their daughter, and their lives were once again peaceful, happy, and fire-free. Icy Flames, St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. A century-old house, Wilcott's Lane, in St. John's, Newfoundland, was said to be haunted by mysterious fires, but not the sort that scorch walls or leave curtains in flames. All the fires in the house burned cold. After its elderly owner died, no one lived in the house for a year or so. But every now and then, passerbys would think there must be someone there, because they could see a flickering glow in the window of a room on the second floor. Worried about the place going up in smoke, they'd go in to have a look around. Each time they'd find the house empty, but they'd also find a fire burning in the fireplace. Second floor bedroom, when the fire would go out as mysteriously as it had begun. Unlike the Caledonia Mills fires, these fires never ignited or scorched anything. But like those fires, these fires had burned cold. After each fireplace flare-up, the stone hearth retained not even a hint of warmth. Too close for comfort, Thetis Lake, British Columbia. Thetis Lake Park is a nature lover's haven about 12 kilometers west of downtown Victoria on Vancouver Island. Within minutes, anyone wanting a break from fast-paced city life can retreat there to enjoy more leisurely activities such as camping, canoeing, fishing, hiking, swimming, and birdwatching. But outrunning nasty monsters, that's not usually high on anyone's list of things to do at the beach. It certainly wasn't what two teenage boys, Gordon Pike and Robin Llewellyn, had in mind when they headed out to Thetis Lake on August 19, 1972. They were just hanging out on the sandy beach when the water near the shore started to bubble and churn. Then, to their horror, a gurgling, scale-covered, four-legged, web-footed, man-sized creature shot out of the water and headed straight for them. Terrified, the two young men turned and ran to their car. The monster followed closely behind. For a brief second, it actually caught up with them and jabbed one boy's hand with its hideous spiked head. Gordon and Robin made it safely to the car and sped off toward the local RCMP station. Once the police officers calmed them down, they listened patiently to the boys. They sounded sincere, and one of them did have a cut on his hand, so the Mounties thought they might be telling the truth. But it wasn't until 4 days later when two more people reported seeing a silver-scaled creature with bulging eyes and a spiked fin-like crown on the top of its head rise up out of Thetis Lake that they began to seriously investigate Gordon's and Robin's tale of terror. However, after weeks of police work and with no further reports or sightings that might have provided them with hard evidence of the monster's existence, the Mounties had no choice but to abandon their investigation. The case of the Thetis Lake monster may be filed away somewhere with other cold cases that most likely will never be solved. The monster doesn't keep popping up the same way other lake monsters do, so nobody is too interested in figuring out what it is or was. After all, it hasn't made a report appearance since its dramatic surfacing back in the early 1970s. But that's probably just as well. Unlike other lake monsters, the creature from Thetis Lake could walk and even run on land, and it actually attacked somebody. Who'd want a creature like that hanging out in a park just a few minutes' drive from the heart of a major city. Its possible presence isn't something to promote as a tourist attraction.
Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.